Hi, thank you all for coming on this slightly warmer here in State College day than it has been lately. This is a webinar on communication in the disinformation age, and we're very glad you're here. We have three marvelous authors tonight. Ashley Rose Mehlenbacher, author of On Expertise, Cultivating Character, Goodwill, and Practical Wisdom. Seong Jae Min, author of Rethinking the New Technology of Journalism, How Slowing Down Will Save the News. And Billie Murray, author of Combating Hate, a Framework for Direct Action. I'm going to ask each author to tell us a little bit about their book, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and they'll be taking your questions. You can submit a question via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If your question is for a specific author, please note that, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. So we're going to start off this evening with Ashley, who is experiencing some weather. So if she suddenly cuts out, she hasn't abandoned us. She's been forced off and will return. She's Canada Research Chair in Science, Health, and Technology Communication in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Waterloo. She's the author of Science Communication Online, Engaging Experts and Publics on the Internet, and co-editor of Emerging Genres in New Media Environments. Ashley.
Thank you. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Excellent. So I'll jump right in, and we were sort of given the 5 to 10 minutes, so I'll probably be on the shorter side of that. So yeah, thank you for everyone, and thank you for attending on a Friday afternoon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and I'll start with maybe where I started the project and what interested me in this concept of expertise. And really I was studying citizen science groups around the disaster at Fukushima Daiichi and how they were collecting radiation contamination readings. And these groups really developed forms of expertise that were interesting and impressive. They really sort of, so citizen scientists are everyday people who get involved in scientific research in some way. So they don't necessarily have training in these areas, but they've cultivated these capacities. So as I studied these groups, there were lots of questions about what kinds of expertise do they have? How are they developing their expertise? So this was sort of generative of these questions of how do we really think about expertise and expert status? So as I began to approach this project, there's of course numerous fields studying the question of expertise, from psychology to the biological sciences, philosophy, sports science, rhetoric, sociology, and STS, of course, to name a few of the fields. And expertise itself, of course, has intensified in interest among the public right now with COVID, climate change, these sorts of quite wicked problems that we're dealing with. So there are a variety of aspects of expertise that are much more complicated than sort of the vernacular definitions we tend to use for the term. So when we define expertise or expert status, I was really interested to know, what do each of these fields bring to this concept, or these sets of concepts? How do they help us see different aspects of these terms or their use? And of course, each field has its own way of studying the problems, their particular interests in these problems, and the lenses that they bring to it. So they offer different advantages for understanding expertise or expert status. So to kind of give a concrete example of the complications of expertise, I think we can all think of various COVID-related scenarios, but an interesting one, I think, is, when we first saw how modeling of disease spread was considered, right? And who should be the experts speaking to this, and how do public health officials use these models, and how do they communicate that to the public? But also among experts, there was a lot of debate about who exactly is the appropriate person to be doing the modeling, right? Can an economist or physicist model this, or what are the epidemiologists saying, and what are the kinds of expertise they're bringing to these problems? So in addition to the kind of technical questions that we think about, or the technical criteria with respect to expertise, the pandemic has also shown us that all of these issues are deeply entailed with ethical questions. And that is, the technical questions themselves are. So this is true among communicating with the public, but also experts themselves. So this is a thread that I follow in the book and really try to think about what are some of these ethical entailments and how do we complicate them. And coming from the perspective of rhetoric, I look through the lens of virtue ethics, which of course other rhetoricians of science studying expertise have taken up concepts like phronesis to really look at how expertise is unfolding rhetorically, relationally, moving past technical and specialist forms of knowledge to interactions with publics and others. And of course, expertise is not just a profession or specialization sort of centered term. We can also have generalist experts as well. So we can talk about some of those issues. But all of these public-facing questions also entail questions of trust in the relationship of experts in public. So I think that might maybe be a theme that is related to these questions of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, how we adjudicate experts if we're not experts in some area. So in the book itself, I report participant data, and there were sort of two groups that I talked to. Some were multidisciplinary scientists or scientists who work on multidisciplinary teams. So those are folks who sort of join teams that have a bunch of different specializations or experts. And one of the things they've got to do is sort of figure out, you know, is somebody an expert, right? And if you're not also in the same field as someone, you don't have the technical competencies necessarily to make those assessments. So you have to rely on some other ways of trying to assess expertise. And of course, there are sociological models that talk about this, but from the rhetorical side, I was really interested on how people are making some of those assessments about someone's character or the way they're able to operate in a team, these sort of relational aspects. And I also talked to citizen scientists who, you know, I said at the beginning, citizen science was really generative of this project. And that's because citizen scientists offer, I think, a rich understanding of the different forms of expertise that different folks are going to bring to projects and really push us outside of sort of technical focus or specialization focused definitions of expertise or expertising or expertises, but also the forms of knowledge that we're generating in the process of these activities. So, you know, citizen scientists have various technical expertises, and a citizen scientist might very well be a scientist in some other domain, but they also have other forms of knowledges that are really important, including local knowledge and so on. So all of this sort of working through the book and talking to these folks, a lot of the threads that come together really are about how do we enact expertise, how do we expertise in a very practical way. So I think rhetoric is instructive in these areas because it really helps us think about those relational aspects, those persuasive aspects of how experts are able to operate toward publics, but also with each other. And in all of this, there's of course not just the technical or scientific questions that they're grappling with, but there's always these underlying ethical entailments, which is really sort of what I thought was quite interesting. And I think when we talk about things like misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, all of these issues are also entailed by deeply ethical questions that hopefully we can chat about today. So I'll leave things there, and thanks again, everyone.
Thank you very much for that. And you pointed to two themes that I think are going to run throughout this, which are ethics and the role of the citizen. And I think we're going to see some really productive conversations there. So our next speaker is Seong Jae Min, Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Pace University. He's the author of As Democracy Goes, So Goes Journalism, Evolution of Journalism in Liberal, Deliberative, and Participatory Democracy. SJ, it's to you.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here with these great scholars. So yeah, my book, you know, I just received a hard copy, so I'm very happy about it. Yeah. So my book is about the critique of technologies used in journalism. I mean, technologies are essential in journalism, from the printing press to computers in the internet. Technologies play vital roles in the development of journalism. That being said, in this book, I suggest that the current journalism industry is too much preoccupied with technological tools and innovations, and they are going too fast. So I argue that we need to slow down And rather than technological bells and whistles, we have to really think about the journalism's core missions and functions and the public interest role in society. So that's the overall theme of the book. So I started the book with this idea of, I don't know whether I can able to share a screen, but it's not that I have to, yeah. So I started this book with the idea of technology as a savior of journalism. So the current dominant narrative in the journalism industry is this technology as a savior of journalism. And this idea becomes very clear if you look at the job postings. So these are some job postings from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. Visual news designer, data engineer, computer scientist, social media engagement manager, machine learning specialist. So you are more likely to see these kind of advertisements, okay, rather than, so news organizations are interested in hiring these people rather than actual reporters and writers because they believe in technology. I also did some kind of formal discourse analysis looking at the editorials and opinion columns from major journalism trade publications, and there emerged a dominant theme, which is using technology to reinvent journalism. So lots of these editorials say that news organizations and journalists have to be nimble, have to be adept at technology use and technological innovations. And the question is, why do we see this kind of narrative of technology as a savior of journalism? That's because the journalism business has been in trouble for so many years. People do not trust journalists. The business model is failing. The workforce is shrinking, and today tech giants like Google and Facebook are taking over journalism. So against these threats and problems, journalism organizations resort to technology to deliver journalism from its crisis. So to remain relevant and to survive in the competitive market, they resort to technology as a savior of journalism. But I argue that technology is not a savior of journalism. And to build up this argument, I introduced this idea of social construction of technologies. So we see these popular arguments that technologies change journalism from the printing press to computers and the internet. For example, hey, the printing press gave birth to newspapers. Telegraph totally changed news writing style. Computers and the internet totally changing journalism business, which may be true, but I kind of show that the other way around is true. Okay, so society and human agency also construct technologies. Like for example, yes, the printing press may have given birth to newspapers, but if you look at closely, from the start of Gutenberg printing press to the proliferation of newspapers in Western Europe, it took like 150 years. So the change was very slow, marked by many failures and many problems and issues. And you may also argue that it's not the printing technology per se, but more of the European middle classes, economic power and literacy that gave birth to newspapers. So you can apply these kind of social construction of technologies arguments to other journalism technologies. So toward the end of the book, I argue that what matters in today's journalism, what matters in this age of disinformation and misinformation is not technological bells and whistles, but traditional values of journalism. Traditional values of journalism meaning things like independence, curiosity, writing a good narrative, asking difficult questions, knocking on door, talking to people, and verifying facts. So those are more important values than technologies and fast breaking news. So to more advance this idea, I kind of borrowed from this slow movement that began around the 1980s. So slow food as opposed to fast food, slow living, slow city. All these movements express the idea that we need to slow down. We need to slow down our life's pace to be more sustainable, to be happier. Okay? So I apply this idea of slow movement to journalism, which became slow journalism. And I introduced some interesting examples of contemporary slow journalism efforts. But for the sake of time, I'm just gonna show you this quick quote from the book. Like slowly cooked food is more nutritious and environmentally sustainable, journalism done slowly and carefully is more helpful and sustainable. Okay, so yeah, so that's kind of a quick recap of the book. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, SJ. And finally, we have Billie Murray, Associate Professor of Communication at Villanova University. Her scholarship has appeared in some of the top journals in the field, including Argumentation and Advocacy, Communication Theory, and the Western Journal of Communication. Billie.
Thank you so much. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. I can't seem to, there we go. Okay, can everybody see that? We're good? Okay, excellent. So thank you so much, Professor Stuckey, for moderating today, and also thank you to Kate and all of the amazing people at Penn State University Press. I'm really honored to be here with these two other scholars. I'm very excited to hear more about your work and to continue talking about it. Just in terms of a content warning, I will be showing some images from my fieldwork that include some hate group symbols such as Confederate flags and swastikas and other sort of hate speech or references to hate motivated violence. So please just be aware of that. When I began this project in 2014, I usually had to convince people that hate speech and hate group organizing was a problem. Most people believed then that hate was just something that existed on the extremist fringes of society or was the purview of sort of edgelords and internet trolls, and certainly not something worthy of our attention or research. Of course, I no longer really have to convince people that America has a hate problem. In fact, the Southern Poverty Law Center, who collects data on hate groups, is careful to warn us that hate and extremism in America has not diminished. Instead, it has coalesced into a broader movement that is both threatening our democracy at the community level and embracing violence as a means to achieve white supremacist goals. So if we can all agree that there's a hate speech problem, then the most commonly suggested solution to this problem, both now and for many, many decades, has been to meet hate speech with more speech. In my book, I take a close look at this more speech solution, or what's also referred to as the counter speech system in the United States. The counter speech system holds that we must not counter hate speech with laws or government regulations, but with a public response. And what that means is that unlike nearly all of our democratic peer nations, the United States has placed the responsibility for combating hate speech solely on the public, who engages in this more speech in order to allow the marketplace of ideas, our sort of democratic processes of debate or dialogue, to just win out over hate speech. And so as I worked on this project, I was surprised to find that there was very little research that actually delved into what more speech actually looks like in practice. And so I began my research in the public spaces of the counter speech system, engaging in rhetorical field methods and taking a scholar activist approach in those spaces where hate groups were having rallies and demonstrations, while other members of the public protested using more speech in response to the hate rallies. These included actions against anti-LGBTQIA hate groups, such as Westboro Baptist Church, as well as a number of neo-Nazi, Klan, and other white supremacist hate group rallies. Using this fieldwork, I worked to develop a typology of more speech tactics that are detailed extensively in the book. But these more speech tactics fall into two broad categories: persuasive dialogic tactics and confrontational tactics. In the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly talk about confrontational tactics. These tactics focus on combating hate through direct action and a definitive no to hate groups in public spaces of protest. For example, apolitical tactics can involve a tactic known as an angel action, which involves activists dressing in flowing white angel costumes with about 10-foot wingspans rising about 7 feet high. And they create what I call a corporeal shield, wherein these community members use their bodies to create barriers between mourners and the hate group. Celebratory tactics, which are used in non-funeral context, include meeting hate with love, right? With things such as public dance parties, same-sex kiss-ins, and other celebrations of LGBTQ pride. They often involve noise brigades to drown out hate speech with, things like kazoos or brass bands, or people dressing up as religious figures with signs, complete with Bible verses that say things such as God hates mixed fabrics or God hates figs. Oppositional tactics are usually enacted by concerned publics engaging in traditional nonviolent protest practices such as making and displaying signs, participating in chants, giving speeches, marching through public spaces. And although I would argue that these tactics can be really effective in pushing the boundaries of our more speech choices, I would argue that they do remain entrenched within the context of the counter-speech system and therefore remain limited in their effectiveness. For example, confrontational tactics do not prevent hate group organizing or hate speech dissemination. They're simply reactive. And it's this limitation that brought me to sort of the second key contribution of the book, in which I argue that although the counter-speech system presents us with this wonderful vision of democracy in action, it's one that requires us to imagine a pristine space of democratic deliberation, one in which various publics sort of presents persuasive arguments against hate speech, and those arguments win due to their inherent reasonableness. But Anthony Wilden's context theory helps us to better understand this counter-speech system. Instead, he argues that we should sort of understand that communicative systems like this enable but also constrain particular ways of responding, in my case, to hate speech. The counter-speech system is built on an assumption that hate speech is simply an issue with two sides, that power contexts are irrelevant, and that the better side will simply win out through this more speech. But this violates a basic premise in all of communication studies and certainly of context theory. Put simply, we all know humans act with language, and action is possible because of humans' use of language. A maxim by Kenneth Burke is one that I use in the book that I think is rather apt. He says, to call a man a murderer is to propose a hanging, or within the context of hate speech, to call people vermin is to propose their extermination. The counter-speech system then produces the idea that all parties to the system are aligned strategically, that hate groups, the state, and the publics combating hate are all working towards the same ultimate goal, which is just engaging in free speech that's essential to democracy. But this taken for granted framing leaves most of us ignorant about the actual strategy of hate groups. Hate groups are operating under a very different strategy than those who confront them. They are not simply engaging in their free speech as a means to participate in democracy. Their actions are instead expressions of a very different strategy, one that can be characterized as fascist. Understood in this way, hate speech is a public organizing tactic used to fulfill the ends of a fascist strategy. It's not just a hateful message we can combat with a loving message. Instead, hate speech is a tactic, and it's a tactic that's used to recruit more members into their ranks, to intimidate minoritized targets, and prevent those people from engaging in their own free speech, which is obviously very anti-democratic. And so here's where in the book I push us to reimagine what kind of tactics might better combat hate, not just at the immediate level of standing up to hate groups when they have their rallies, which is obviously very important, but at a systemic level where they have the potential to do the most harm to our democratic system. And it's here that I explore the combative tactics deployed most regularly by anti-fascists. Although combative tactics appear in the spaces of the counter-speech system, they are not more speech tactics. Anti-fascists, the majority of whom are anti-authoritarian, sort of reject the idea that this hate speech, free speech debate is about the free speech rights of fascists. For them, the question is about the political struggle against fascism. And so as a result, anti-fascists recognize that hate speech is not simply a content neutral type of political speech used to fulfill the ends of democracy. Instead, hate speech is a tactic used to further that fascist strategy. So for anti-fascists, operating within the constraints of the counter-speech system doesn't allow them to combat the fascist strategy, of which hate speech is just one tactic. So when they deploy combative tactics, anti-fascists frame their operations according to sort of a central ethical and ideological justification, explicitly stating that anti-fascism is self-defense. Self-defense in this formulation not only includes the protection of an individual person from harm, but also includes protecting sort of the larger community or society from fascist organizing that leads to large-scale violence. So this kind of proactive stance constitutes what Wilden would call an indirect approach. In this approach, activists attack not against the enemy's main strength or weakness, but against their most accessible material. And the most common combative tactic in this approach is called deplatforming. By providing a platform for hate groups to have rallies, the state is actually allowing such group to garner the benefits of their protection while they organize, recruit new followers, intimidate minoritized people, embolden each other, and further their ideologies. Therefore, in order to defend against the spread of hate speech and eventual fascist violence, anti-fascists work to deplatform hate groups by using black blocs, like you see here, or other sort of physical methods to block access to the rally space. And this is the purpose of the property destruction that is most often incorrectly framed in mainstream media. Deplatforming is a tactic intended to attack the enemy's most accessible material, their state-protected hate speech platform. So in other words, anti-fascists do not accept the state's claims of content neutrality in public spaces of protest. In fact, combative tactics are deemed necessary precisely because the state uses its power and monopoly on violence to platform the hate speech that leads to fascism. So when anti-fascists chant things like cops and Klan go hand in hand, or who do you serve, who do you protect, they're placing the state and the police squarely within that fascist strategy. And so combative tactics reveal the limits of the counter-speech system and show us that we cannot depend on the state to use its monopoly on violence to combat fascism or hate. And so in the final chapter, I sort of talk about how can we sort of ally all of these tactics together, the confrontational, the persuasive dialogic, and the combative, so that we can more effectively sort of work inside and outside of this system. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I want to remind the audience that we're going to take some questions from our attendees. You can submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And again, if your question is for a particular author, please indicate that in the question. I want to start the Q&A though with a little bit of discussion between the panelists. It seems to me, as I said earlier, that we are all talking here about certain kinds of ethical questions, citizenship questions, communicative questions in, as this panel announces, the disinformation age. So I wanted to give each panelist a minute or two while you guys are writing your questions out to perhaps think about putting your book in conversation with one of the other books here. Ashley, since you went first before, I'm going to have you go last this time. So I'm going to go in order of SJ, Billie, and then Ashley to put your books in a little bit of conversation.
Yes, thank you. I see great connections among these books. I mean, my chief interest is in journalism and how journalism can do better to create more democratic discourse. And I'm interested in some new forms of movements happening in journalism today. And you will see things like citizen journalism, okay, very popular these days. Scientists, doctors, lawyers engage in journalism. And there are many journalists, citizen journalists that I follow, and I believe their expertise is much better than just professional journalists interviewing scientists and lawyers and doctors. So new forms of expertise is taking place in the journalistic space now. And then going to Billie's book, I think again, I see journalism should do more than providing just information in a balanced in journalistic objective way, right? I see Billie's position that to be more combative, kind of very seductive and appealing. So same idea may apply to journalism too. I mean, you should not be confined to the idea of journalistic objectivity, just providing information only. How can you remain neutral when you see George Floyd being killed by police brutality? You should do something about it. You should go beyond the neutrality and objectivity and even become an activist. So I think new forms of communication is needed both from journalistic spheres and also in broadly from the general civil society. Yeah.
Did you want me to just jump right in, Dr. Stuckey? Okay, I completely agree with SJ that I think that's actually really on point with what I would say are some of the connections here. I would simply add to that in terms of the expertise point. I would love to see people start to understand that anti-fascists are actually experts on the right wing. There are so many instances of sort of our law enforcement agencies and journalists and researchers using the research and expertise that anti-fascists have developed over time to sort of, combat right wing and fascist sort of organizing. But of course, they don't really ever get the credit for that. And they're obviously demonized in most of the accounts of them in sort of mainstream media. So I see this idea of expertise and how we sort of understand expertise as being a very like a malleable thing that we could apply to others as well. In terms of SJ's work, obviously the technology point is really interesting in terms of journalists using tech on the ground, in terms of filming activists doing this kind of work. I have a lot of conversations with journalists about the ethics of that because of things like doxing and sort of putting people in danger. But we're really involved in that tech, and the idea of this slow journalism of like talking to people and sort of taking that step back instead of the whole it leads, and they're doing this to get media attention, which is a really outdated way of thinking about that. I think that your sort of expertise on this slow journalism, I think, could really benefit sort of people understanding these kinds of activists in very different ways. So I see, sort of lots of connections between these as well.
Great. Yes, I agree on all of those points. I think, and this may be a little more ambiguous in terms of what I'm thinking, but I'm thinking of the case in Canada here of the truckers that occupied Ottawa. And I see even just in that case, a lot of connections. I'm thinking of the journalists who were on the ground reporting this, and citizen journalists as well, and the use of social media and reporting what was happening, but also the way that journalists were attacked and sort of, grouped in with the experts, the elite, right? These sorts of things, and the sort of dangers for journalists in these spaces where, we see hate being enacted in these ways. And what we also saw in Ottawa were things like those hate symbols, right? Confederate flags, swastikas. So I think there's also something probably, again, going back to journalism, about also the influence of US journalism and media in other countries like Canada, and these symbols and that sort of, we have hate speech laws here, but how they're enacted and the tactics that are used may not necessarily always work. And I think the ways to combat hate in a democracy are going to be portable in terms of thinking about those strategies that anti-fascists would use, especially as we come to grapple with those similar kinds of issues.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. Actually, I got so interested, I forgot I was moderating. SJ, we've had a question come through for you. One of our attendees would like to know if it necessarily follows that slowing down will necessarily make us think more carefully, either when it comes to journalism or in life. Is slowness a direct link to thoughtfulness, or does it just pose the possibility of thoughtfulness?
Hey, thank you. I mean, it's, slow journalism is kind of a new emerging idea, and the entire idea of slowness actually began, from the early 20th century philosophers. So there's actually great literature on how to slow down one's life and how to have a meaningful life, and then you can also make a connection to Buddhism and mindfulness on slow living. So the slow journalism literature right now is actually very thin, and we haven't done many research in this area, so it's an emerging field. But at this point out, just say that it points toward a new possibility. Okay, so it's more of a criticism of contemporary journalism who are just occupied with speed. Okay, so it's a sort of kind of at this point kind of an antidote to that idea, and we are starting to see some projects and publications popping up implementing this idea of slow journalism.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Attendees, I would like to remind you that the Q&A box is open. Please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. We have a question in general for everyone, and this time we'll start with Billie, move to Ashley, and then end with SJ. And I'd like to hear your thoughts specifically on the role of the citizen here. Many of you have pointed out that a lot of the responsibility for things seems to lie in the hands of the citizen, who may mobilize a certain kind of expertise. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, please.
So I'm starting. So I think basically in terms of my work, citizens are the ones that have been placed with the entirety of the burden of combating hate. That has been solely left to them because the government will not intervene in terms of regulating. And so I see that as a very important burden, but one that is also very difficult. Because of who is considered a citizen, right? Who gets to be a citizen, sort of in our rhetorical imagination, people that are sort of seen as, so the state sort of says, you have all the responsibility, but we're also going to tell you the right way to do this. And the way that we're going to tell you how to do this is through the use of riot control agents and tear gas and things like that, so go combat hate, but only do it in this way. And so it's this very weird position that we put people in to be able to enact this duty that they have been placed with, but only in certain ways that the state finds amenable to what they want to do. And so to me, the idea of thinking of citizens again in relation to Ashley's book about like as experts on this, since it's their key responsibility, that the state needs to back off of those kinds of, if they're not going to do anything to help, then leave it to the citizens to do it in the most effective way that they can. I'm not sure if that totally answered your question, Dr. Stuckey.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll pick up on that a little bit. And I think that's a great point too about the concept of citizen and who gets to be a citizen, who's seen as a citizen, and sort of problematizing that. And I think in a lot of citizen science, early discourse, especially as the sort of term was gaining traction, there was a lot of discussion about that and how to kind of think about that. And in some ways, I think the most ideal version of that is sort of a citizen of Earth kind of idea of citizenship, where stewardship is really important and kind of taking care of the planet, especially in ecological citizen science. But I think there's also roots that show us the ways that citizens are, in whatever sort of definition we're using, oppressed by governments, but also experts. So a lot of citizen science projects that I've been especially interested in are what might be called bottom-up citizen science. So this is where the communities come together and they design and run these projects. And a lot of them have ties to environmental justice, right? So when people have been ignored in their communities by whether it's governments, bureaucrats, or experts, they collect data and they sort of mobilize these projects. And if this of course draws on a much longer history of environmental justice, especially in the United States, right? I'm thinking of the, Warren County, North Carolina, and these sort of really critical movements to push back and challenge those sort of technocratic decision-making that are not in service of communities and not even good technical decision making. So I think those are some areas that maybe might be interesting to think about.
I have a kind of a slightly different idea about citizens' role today. Citizen power, citizen participatory democracy is great, and it has been the term kind of determining our era, right? Participatory power from civil disobedience to direct actions, whatever. It really is a great way to advance and change society. But what I see these days is that we hear this term, this idea of participatory fatigue. So everyone's doing whatever they want to do, and it causes kind of a fatigue in participation. So I think these days I'm trying to think that the role of institutions and maybe a professional journalist, to sort of guide those the power of citizens to some kind of changes in a larger society through institutions. So I think citizen power is great, but they should be channeled properly, I guess. So that's what I was thinking these days.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions in the queue. This first one is, I am curious about how one might maintain a balance between reminding people of suspect issues, i.e. keep showing Trump, but at the same time not pushing it to the point of giving such individuals airspace in journalism or personal conversations. We don't want to forget, but we also don't want to glorify people by keeping them in the news. Is balance possible, and is it different for different situations, i.e. journalism, TV media, and so on? Who would like to take that question?
I think that's probably the question for me. No, I don't think the balance is possible. I mean, I think journalists should not give voice to like a fringe voices, like hate speeches. Just by doing that, by reporting that kind of issue, you are giving a life to these fringe conspiracy theories. But then again, as someone said, as Linda said in the question, if it's Trump, if it's the president, then you have to report about what he said, right? Although it's conspiracy theories and not factual. So journalists should have to take care to report remarks from, say, Trump. I don't know, they suggest like a truth sandwich method. So the reporters should, in the beginning, say that, hey, this is not true, this is not factual, but this is what Trump reported, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, you also emphasize that this is not true, right? So that they call it a truth sandwich method or something. So yeah, in general, I think it's not a good idea to give voice to hate speeches or some conspiracy theories. But if it's President Trump or some prominent figure, then you have to take a great care to report that kind of thing.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? Okay, my next question is for Dr. Mehlenbacher. I've heard the criticism that the ability to read up on topics on the internet has given non-experts a false sense of expertise. Did that show up in your research? What differentiates that kind of false expertise from the citizen expertise you described?
That's a great question. Thank you. So So it didn't exactly come up in that way in the research or in this book. I have been doing a bit of work on that more recently, though. So I guess where I'd start is saying with citizen scientists, some of the distinction there is these are folks who are really invested in learning about how to do the science. So not just sort of going out and, reading a bit about it and then claiming to have some expertise, but they're sort of out there collecting data, figuring out better ways to do this, working with different kinds of experts to inform their methods and their approach. So there's sort of this real commitment to getting knowledge and really good knowledge. But I think the broader question about how folks do this, and I do think they do that, right? So you read some stuff on the internet and then you think, got a pretty good handle on this, right? So, and I think lots of folks are guilty of that, including different kinds of experts when they're reading across into different areas. But I've been working with a philosopher of science, Katie Plaisance, and we've been thinking a lot about epistemic humility. And I think this gets at some of that. So most of the participants that I talk to always sort of, they're not the first person to say they're an expert, right? So, so they have lots of epistemic humility. They're very aware of the limitations of what they know and how to kind of interrogate what they know in ways that are really important. So I think these ideas of things like epistemic humility or understanding the limitations of your knowledge are what experts really are working with when they're doing that. And I think folks who sort of, maybe read a little bit and then figure they know better than the experts aren't really engaging in those concepts necessarily in serious ways. And I think some of the work, I'm thinking of Vices of the Mind by Kassam really gets at this, which is, the epistemic vices are the things that are going to get in the way of our knowledge, right? So experts want to be really cautious about the kinds of epistemic vices that might get in the way of their knowledge. And we want to think a lot about things like epistemic humility. But I think that inclination to think we maybe know more than we do is something that everybody, experts and non-experts, want to watch for. And that's a great point that you've raised. Thank you.
Anybody else want to jump in there? Okay, so we have another question here, which is somebody's quite interested in the term malformation. Is that recently formed term? We talk about misinformation and disinformation, and we distinguish that from information. What exactly is malinformation?
Should I jump in? Okay, so the way I've been using it is malinformation is not necessarily factually wrong. So you might fact check something and it's technically true, but the way that you're using it, the information is distorted or decontextualized. So it sort of leads people to conclusions that aren't correct, right? So so as opposed to just being entirely factually incorrect, it may have aspects that are true, but the presentation of this information or the way it's been used is going to distort the actual knowledge that it originally was trying to present when it moved out of context, or was sort of maliciously moved out of context.
A new word for me too, so thank you for that. All of your books, it seems to me, bring theory to bear on what I consider to be, or what appear to me to be some very important ethical considerations. All of you have at root an ethic behind, or a set of ethics behind what you've discussed in your books. And I wondered if you might want to say a bit about how you understand questions of public virtue or virtue in public life, and how you locate that, like communities, individuals, who's responsible. We'll start with you, I think, SJ.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, the role of journalism in society should be serving the public's interest and contributing to democracy and maintaining good public discourse. And so for that purpose, I kind of talked about how to fight disinformation and misinformation. Okay? And for that purpose, you should go beyond technological solutions and technological innovations, and you have to go back to the essence of journalism, which is verifying facts and synthesizing information and things like that. So yeah, I think the recent movement in journalism is that we have to go back to the idea of public, okay? And what it means by public and why journalism exists. It's to serve the public, right? So we have to define what public is and why journalism exists first in the first place, okay? And that's what journalism should do. Okay.
I'll jump in terms of ethics. I think the way that ethics are talked about in the free speech, hate speech debate is about the most ethical thing is that all speech is content neutral, right? That the government should allow all free speech and, with some exceptions, but that it's all ethical because it's all contributing to our democratic deliberations, with no sort of consideration of the fact that the system that speech is operating in is not ethical to begin with, right? We don't all have equal access to the spaces of public deliberation. Hate speech makes that access even more tenable. And so I think we need to think more clearly about the ethics of allowing speech that silences others, that incites violence, things like that, because the way we think about ethics is sort of this very sort of mythical idea that all content is valuable. And if it's not, it's easily dismissed and doesn't have any effect in the world, which is simply not true in practice. And so I think the ethics of that is that we need to sort of be able to think about how, and I get in a lot of trouble when I say things like this, but some speech is better than others, right? The speech that sort of defames and denigrates and does a violence is unethical. And it's not enough to simply say, well, it's unethical, right? It because it's being given that platform. So for me, the ethical sort of ways of thinking about that need to change. In terms of sort of protest tactics, most of the tactics that particularly anti-fascists engage in are seen as unethical because they're portrayed as violent, even if it's sort of a property destruction violence. The way people talk about looting and property destruction erases the idea that it's operating within a system that has a corrupt ethicality to begin with. And so to me, you can't sort of judge those tactics until you look at the context and that system that they're operating in, that sort of close the way we think about those topics and sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater sort of thing. And so to me, that sort of ethical question is just permeates all of these questions for sure.
So I guess I'll try to restrict this. So I guess one of the key areas that I think for thinking about experts and expertise in this idea of virtue in the public life is even just introducing ethics a little more comfortably back into the conversation, because I think rightfully some scientists are reluctant, some experts are reluctant, some technical folks are reluctant to get into these conversations because they are difficult conversations, and the idea of objectivity of the experts has been so central to sort of their ethos for a long time. But of course, the pandemic showed us that doesn't really work, right? And that's not really actually what's happening. So I think, for example, one area that it has harmed experts not to openly talk about that has been during the pandemic, where and this goes back to the sort of ethical or unethical structures that are operating, there have been a lack of resources in Canada, sort of a lack of funding in healthcare, right? So public health officials don't actually have what they need to do their jobs. And that is an unethical system that has been forced upon them for a variety of reasons. So having those conversations is really important. But I think on the other side, in sort of these questions of, probably related to hate tactics, but also conspiratorial thinking, sort of suggesting there's a lack of objectivity has been a tactic used against experts, right? So I think there's a real tension there in terms of how we talk about it. So I think having that conversation more directly about how those things operate is really important. But then also on the public side, right, sort of engaging in some of those conversations as well, right? And I think, you know, I agree with Billy, the sort of, the public's got a responsibility to say some speech, like that's sort of paraphrasing Mark Maron here, right? But that's still not okay. You can't say that, right? So those kinds of ethical engagements too. And I think that does relate to, I tend to look at the sort of STEM areas, but there's certainly a lot of that going on in the sort of hate speech that's now being used to deny climate instead of climate specifically. So I think all of those
Ashley, you're breaking
complexities
up a
need
little
to
bit. So I'm gonna, oh, you seem to be back. Okay, so I'm gonna, at this moment, we're almost out of time. So I'm gonna give each panelist 1 minute, just one, y'all, to answer our final audience question. How optimistic are you about the level of feasibility in implementing these the changes that you advocate into the general public? What's your level of optimism? 1 minute. Billy, SJ, and then Ashley, go.
Okay, I'm incredibly optimistic. Every time I am on the ground with activists, my optimism is renewed. The things that I call for in the book in terms of allying these very different tactics, people who have different sort of senses of what's ethical and not in those spaces, I've actually already seen activists working together. I mean, if you look at Charlottesville, anti-fascist activists protected nonviolent activists for as much as they possibly could against violence. So they're already doing these things. And so what I sort of think would make it more feasible is sort of a more deliberate sort of deployment of these kind of tactics, these sort of allying these tactics together in a more deliberate, systematic way. But I'm absolutely optimistic that that can happen because I'm already seeing it happen, especially in the past, I would say 3 to 4 years.
Right now, I'm kind of pessimistic. So this issue of hate speeches, disregard of expertise, misinformation, disinformation is a global issue, but also uniquely American. I think there's a much more serious problem of hate speeches and misinformation in America, and that's because we have this partisan culture. People live in tribes and two-party system. The legal system that the freedom of speech triumphs everything. So and then the commercial media system dominates the scene. So we have to change the structure. We have to change the whole culture. Otherwise, I don't see these kind of tactics kind of making a traction. So.
So I'll sort of do half and half. So when I see the citizen scientists and the work they're doing and experts who are engaged in their research, very optimistic. But then I also see sort of what SJ was just talking about, that sort of partisanship, even though we're not bipartisan, sort of coming up in Canada more in terms of our political debate and on the media. So enormously pessimistic about how that's going to play out.
So we have the whole range of optimism available to us from this panel. I just want to thank all of our authors once again for joining us today. 3 wonderful books. I've had the chance to read them. Y'all should do the same. I want to thank everyone who tuned in and everyone who asked questions. Everyone who attended this will receive a follow-up email with links to the books and a special discount. So yay for discounts. If you'd like to find out more about our virtual events, as well as these wonderful books, please visit psupress.org and follow the press on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you all for coming, and to all a good evening.
Thank you.